Hey everybody, OperationZ here, and we're continuing with the story of Abraham, and we're on part 24. And we leave off in 23, where, Sarah doesn't want Hagar and Ishmael to be heir along with her son Isaac. So she tells Abraham that basically she doesn't want them to be a part of it, to be heir with them, because Ishmael was mocking. And, basically when this happens, she, does that and it grieves Abraham. And God tells Abraham, don't worry about it because I'm also going to make him a great nation as well. And he's going to be blessed and they will prosper and make it. And they go out to the wilderness and, they are, I believe, near Beersheba. And when they're there, basically she just casts the child under a shrub and leaves him there because she doesn't want to see him die. And on top of that, you know, they're out of water, they're out of everything that they would need, so they think they're just going to die in the wilderness there. And we're about ready to see what happens next, seeing the faithfulness of God and his promises even to Hagar, who wasn't, part of that covenant with Abraham and Sarah, but God had compassion on Hagar and on Ishmael, Ishmael being the son of Abraham. So let's continue with the story and see what happens, seeing what God's promised already and what takes place. So Genesis 21:17 says this, And God heard the voice of the lad, and the angel of the Lord called unto Hagar out of heaven, and said unto her, What aileth thee, Hagar? Fear not, for God hath the voice of the lad, hath heard the voice of the lad where he is. So we see that God has heard the voice of the lad where he is. Lad just meaning basically child. And, you know, the voice of the Lord heard him, and the angel of the Lord called unto Hagar out of heaven, said unto her, What aileth thee, Hagar? Fear not, for God hath heard the voice of the lad where he is. God saying basically through his angel from heaven, don't worry because God has heard your afflictions and what you go through. The name Ishmael, again, meaning God listens, that he sees what they were going through. And Hagar, when they were in the way in the wilderness, when it was just her and she was pregnant, and she had that big fight with Sarah, and then she fled from before her, and she goes out in the wilderness, and the angel comes and tells her, no, go back, and you'll name your son Ishmael, which means God listens. Go and endure it, basically letting her know she's pregnant and she's got all these things. She doesn't need to be out alone in the wilderness at that point. So it was best for her to go back to the camp of Abraham. And he said, submit onto Sarah. And she did, with that demeanor, to basically have that humility and just, go back to it as hard as the situation was. And, if they'd have waited on God's timing again, it would have been completely avoided altogether. But, we see that she goes back and everything is seemingly better because it's not mentioned. There could have still been striving and fights and all these things taking place. But, while that was going on, it doesn't mention it. But it's, we can assume that there probably was. So, again, fear not, for God hath heard the voice of the lad where he is. God has heard it, God sees it, and God is there for them as revealed through the angel and the angel's voice coming from heaven. And yeah, God heard the voice of the lad. The angel of the Lord called unto Hagar. So that's where we're at there. So Genesis 21:18, arise, lift up the lad, and hold him in thine hand, for I will make him a great nation. So we see here that, again, he's given that promise. The angel's saying, lift him up and arise, because I'm going to make him a great nation. He's going to be okay. You all are not going to die out here in the wilderness. Basically, it's from God, and God will not let them suffer that fate to just die in the wilderness, that their lives would not be in vain, that God was there for them, and God had a plan for them too after what occurred and what happened with the situation. So Genesis 21:19, and God opened her eyes, and she saw a well of water, and she went and filled the bottle with water and gave the lad drink. So, God opened her eyes, and she saw a well of water. God revealed and showed to her that there was a well of water nearby, and she went and filled the bottle with water, gave the lad drink. So basically, they weren't going to suffer the fate of dehydration in the wilderness. That, even though they ran out of water and they're dealing with the hot desert sun and the climate there, and, just all these things, like, again, being pretty hot because they're out in the middle of the desert, and it's probably the heat of the day from the sound of it, that, however long they went without water, that basically dying of thirst was a very high risk at that point. And then she has this vision, and she sees and hears the angel of the Lord from heaven coming down to her and speaking to her. So, just basically painting a picture of what they are, like where they're at, like, why she's so worried that they're going to die of thirst, and it's going to be that way, and it's because of their conditions, their climate, no water, and all these things that, they're suffering. But Genesis 21:20, and God was with the lad, and he grew and dwelt in the wilderness and became an archer. So as we talked about before, he becomes an archer, and I'd say he became a pretty good archer as well on top of that, because he was probably already learning the bow, more than likely being taught by Abraham, because he was going to be taught all these things to inherit. Like, it was kind of like that it was going to be Ishmael that was going to inherit everything from Abraham. So he was being taught the ways of manhood in those days, probably how to use a sword, how to use the bow, how to take care of the cattle, and get everything to go right as a herdsman and a shepherd, as Abraham was. He probably taught him all these things that he knew, like as he was going, because it's his son. And, basically, we see that there. We can just kind of see that it would have been that way. But when it says he became an archer, he was basically as a master of the bow, that, he was very well equipped with using a bow. Like, he was skillful with it, and so much so that it's noteworthy here in the Bible. And when we continue on, Genesis 21:21, and he dwelt in the wilderness of Paran, and his mother took him a wife out of the land of Egypt. So, yeah, like the interesting thing here, the land of Paran, as it says here, that's kind of like, see, that's close to, if I remember correctly, that's around where Abraham came from. And let me look at that. The land of Paran. So we know he came from Haran, but there's also, oh, I'm thinking of Padanaram, if I'm remembering correctly. But so basically, that's where he dwelt, was in that land there. But when Abraham came out, he came from Haran, not Paran. So his mother took him a wife out of the land of Egypt. She was Egyptian, so they went and found him a wife out of Egypt. And, he ended up becoming, as a start of as him being his own nation, Ishmael, his name being, and became Ishmaelites. And you have the Ishmaelite traders, you have the, just the whole thing that would be as of the Ishmaelites. And, when we continue, Genesis 21:22, and it came to pass at that time that Abimelech and Pichol, the chief captain of his host, spake unto Abraham, saying, God is with thee in all that thou doest. So we see here that, what's noteworthy here is that it no longer mentions Ishmael, and then it goes on to the next topic with Abraham again, because that's pretty much Ishmael's story, and we don't really hear from him again till later on in Genesis, and not even so much him, but his descendants, because there's references to the Ishmaelites and so forth. So we know that, that's his story, and that's what God had for him. And, there's occasions where the Ishmaelites are mentioned, as I was saying, but we continue here. Abimelech and Pichol, if I'm saying his name correctly, the chief captain of his host, spake unto Abraham, saying, God is with thee in all that thou doest. So he's saying, God is with you. Everything that you do, God is with you, and he's there for you. We see and observe, and we see all these things that God does for you. Because how else are you going to reap 100-fold in your land? And how else are you going to prosper with all your flocks and have all this great abundance and prosperity such as we have not seen in all of our days? I'm not putting it in my own words, but that's basically what they're saying. Behold, we see God is with you. And they're actually fearful of Abraham and all of his encampment, everything that they have, that, they're fearful of him, because it's not like he's like an army or even a militia or anything like that. But, they just see that they prosper there, and, like he's just got that relatively decent sized camp. Like we know there's a lot of people, because out of that camp, when they went in that fight against the kings that raided Sodom and Gomorrah and all that, and they took Lot and all of them, he took his 318 trained servants, not men of war again, but, they're trained servants that are basically, it's a sizable force. But see, so Abimelech and Pichol, the chief, the captain of his hosts, it's interesting that basically how we see they probably had greater numbers, because these men that are mentioned here are the Philistines, and they've come from basically over the seas from an island, Caphtorim, as it's mentioned. And, it talks about it even earlier in Genesis, that these Philistines, it don't mention how they come over and they start to inhabit in the land of Canaan, but it mentions them in the genealogies when you go through and you read all the genealogies and all that after the descendants of Noah. And I believe, if I remember correctly, they're actually descendants of Ham. But, they derive, it's either Ham or Japheth, but they derive from, basically they derive from that, and they come from Keftorim, which is, on the it's an island region like that, and they come from there and they start to inhabit in the land of Canaan as well. So they're here in Canaan, and they're probably a pretty sizable force, like captain of the host and talk like that. It's basically saying they got this army, but yet because they see how much God prospers them and how much God does for them, that they're weary and worrisome of Abraham and his couple hundred men that he's got, and all that, and just how much God does for them. Like, they're not a big sizable force, but they're weary because of the reverencing respect that they have for his God. Them again having their own gods. They've been worshiping Dagon and so on and so forth, and probably some other ones too for however long, and they just carried these deities with them from that island, Keftorim, and they brought them with them, and all that, which just basically a point of reference to make mention here. So they had as that, but they saw it as very noteworthy, and they gave God glory and praise in their hearts, and they were weary of this man Abraham and his encampment. So much so that they came over to have a talk with them, because they wanted to have a talk with Abraham, and we're going to see what they have to say here. We see that God is with thee in all that thou doest. So Genesis chapter 21, verse 23. Now therefore swear unto me hereby God, that thou wilt not deal falsely with me, nor with my son, nor with my son's son. So what he's proposing here is a generational alliance and truce, that he wants to be safe and secure from Abraham and this mysterious, great and powerful God that they don't yet know, but they know enough to know that it's Abraham's God, and that's why he has everything that he's got, because of God. So he's trying to, basically secure themselves. He's trying to secure his son and his grandson that would continue as him being the leader and as the king of the Philistines. So, and at this point, I also just want to make mention too that the Philistines eventually get bigger, and they take up places in Canaan like Gath and Gaza and all these places. They come over and they inhabit it. And there's 5 capital cities, or not 5 capital cities, but 5 cities and 5 notable princes that are there in Canaan. And, but at this point, it's not that big yet. And, at this point too, there's actually not as many people in the earth at this point too. It is noteworthy because, they have an army, but they're just not as populated. But they're still big enough that they have their own army, as we see here. And Abimelech, the leader, and he's got his captain of the host, this Pickcole, if I'm saying it correctly, but has him, and they're proposing this generational truce and alliance with Abraham, because they don't want to provoke the wrath of his God, and they don't want to mess with Abraham. So it's just something noteworthy here that, as basically one group of people to another, they just seen what God gave them, and they see how powerful God is, which is, it's just as a reverence of God that, and reverence basically meaning, a deep respect, that they have a deep respect for God. So, but according to the kindness that I have done unto thee, thou shalt do unto me, and to the land wherein thou hast sojourned. So basically he's saying, we've always been good to you, and that's as of this point. Later on, there's all these wars and fights, and and it's always this big turmoil, and so on and so forth. But I don't want to get too far ahead. I just, it's for the purpose of pretty much that we just see, you know, from different angles. And sometimes it's good to look ahead a little bit, just because, we can see what happens too ahead of time, and even sometimes what happened before, because it's, it goes well with what's going on in the now where we're at. So it's okay to kind of go around a little bit, so long as don't, it's good for the purpose of, like going this way and that way. And like for the purpose of trying to get the hang of what you're trying to learn, like when you add something to it from later on, it helps, and something from the past that's relevant to the current time. Doing that will help you, it'll just sink, and it helps you to understand, the story better. So, looking ahead a little bit, it's okay to do so, and looking back at what happened before. And so we are there. He's saying, pretty much, we've been kind to you and we've done good by you, and we just want you to do good by us too, that we don't have to be so weary of you or anything, that you're in our land at this point, because that's just where he was encamped, was very close to the Philistines. And it's also worth mentioning too, he was also probably still in allegiance with the Amorites and so forth too, and the Philistines probably knew that. And they were nearby, and they were close enough with Abraham that they all armored, they geared up, and they went, and they took the men of war that they had of the Amorites, and they went along with them to rescue Lot. So they had an alliance already with the Amorites that dwelt in the land. So we have that. And Genesis 21:24, and Abraham said, I will swear. So he's saying, yes, I'll make this covenant with you all, and this truce and this alliance. He's saying that he agrees to do it. And that's where we're going to leave off here. But yeah, so the Philistines, again, I just wanted to make mention, they were from Kaftor, the Kaftor region, which is identified as the island of Crete. That was the part that I forgot to add a minute ago. From the island of Crete. And basically that is, it's kind of like on the other, like it's trying to bring it to memory, but it's just that island region of Kaftor, or Kaftorim. And so that's what we have for this video and this sermon, and that's the message for today here, and you all have a blessed day.